Patrons from distant lands and listeners of old, it is time once again to travel down the Hobbit hole. This one will be kind of a throwback, a topic I never got around to covering, related to one of the videos I published, I think last fall, which was a video on Tolkien's uses of the word power and how that might inform our understanding of the Ring of Power and its powers. My goal there was to demonstrate first that Tolkien does use the word power for distinct concepts. They may all be related, but you can also detect the different senses that the word has. Second, I gave what I thought was evidence that this wasn't entirely accidental or unconscious on his part. Not only would that not fit with Tolkien's reputation for linguistic sensitivity, but we do actually have a fairly explicit document from him talking about the different forms or states or applications of the quality or qualities that could be called power. And then finally, I wanted to apply how that knowledge could affect our interpretation of some of the statements made elsewhere about the rings of power, their functions, and their limitations. And as most of you probably know, I did another video that was just on the rings of power, which nearly ended up being an hour long. So if you remember that video, or even if you don't, but you've just spent enough time in this fandom, you'll know that the Rings of Power are kind of a confusing subject. You have to bring a lot of nuance to understand them, and the different senses of the word power look to me like they were another thing that had to be accounted for. Sometimes we tend to apply an almost mathematical treatment to the question of the rings and how they work, treating power like it's something that's quantifiable, and I don't know that that really lines up perfectly with a lot of Tolkien's other thoughts on the subject. So that's sort of the context of that video and what I was trying to do with it, and something that got mentioned in that video, something that I'm really interested in but didn't really have the time to expand upon in the course of assembling my arguments, was this, I guess you could call it a theory that's broadly referred to as linguistic determinism, and one of the most widely known expressions of this is called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which turns out to be a little bit of a misnomer, but still probably the term that's most widely recognized. I think it's a really fun idea to play around with just in general, but also specifically in application to Tolkien's work on his invented language, and especially in the process of mining his linguistic writings in an attempt to understand more about, yes, on the one hand, Tolkien's own philosophy, but more so how he conceptualized the elves and their cultural assumptions and worldview, things like that. So, according to my understanding, which should always be considered that of an interested layperson rather than a certified expert, linguistic determinism is kind of what the name suggests it is. It's this proposal that the language or languages that a person speaks, most particularly their native language or languages, in some ways determines or affects their thoughts and beliefs. There's sort of a spectrum of possibilities allowed by that hypothesis. On the strong end of the spectrum, linguistic determinism claims that basically your language literally determines and limits your thoughts and what you're capable of conceptualizing and how you're going to conceptualize it. There's not a lot of empirical evidence for that idea, and it also doesn't really jive with lived experience, in my opinion. I'm sure people have seen posts on the internet or lists, or even there's whole books that talk about words or terms in other languages that define a concept we all recognize, but that doesn't necessarily map to a single English term. A really popular example is schadenfreude, which is sort of the satisfaction or pleasure that one can get from seeing someone else's pain. Now, in German, apparently, there's a single term for this, even though, honestly, it's really just two words mashed together because German, that's kind of how it works. And English doesn't have a single word for that concept. You have to describe it with many words in a sort of phrase. But once you've explained schadenfreude, almost everyone is going to intuitively understand the concept that it's referring to, regardless of whether their own language treats it as a single word or something that must be described as a phrase. So, clearly we're all capable of a degree of flexibility when it comes to mapping concepts onto words. As far as I can tell, the super strong version of linguistic determinism doesn't really leave much room for neologisms either. And that's another one where, like, we know from experience, people are always either repurposing words or making new ones. We have things like doom scrolling now. We have abbreviations like YOLO and FOMO that started out representing a whole phrase, but they've now kind of become concepts in themselves. Even slang seems kind of resistant to this. The kindergartner in my life a couple of weeks ago wanted to taste some soup that I was working on, and she had a little sip and said, "Oh, yeah, wow, that's straight fire." And then she kind of took me by the hand and looked me in the eye and very seriously explained, "Don't worry. Fire just means that something's really, really good. It's not like an actual fire." So I got to feel the sting of finally being someone that the younger generation felt they needed to explain slang to. And that was humbling. But the point there was that I could totally understand that the word had acquired an additional meaning. It didn't, like, break down my whole paradigm and leave me rocking back and forth on the floor. Any rocking back and forth on the floor that occurred was the result of an entirely different set of realizations and emotions, more centered on the inevitability of decay and death in a mortal lifespan. Moving on to the weak formulation of linguistic determinism, there is some decent empirical evidence in support of the idea of language affecting thought and affecting culture. And of course, with language being usually considered an expression of culture, culture then goes on to affect language, and this creates a really nice feedback loop and kind of complicates the findings, chicken or egg, word or idea. But still, I don't think it's necessarily mind-blowing for most people to consider that language and thought are related, and in some ways, thought is dependent on language. I know I've heard anecdotes about people who are bilingual reporting that they find it easier or more natural to express certain thoughts and feelings in one language versus other kinds of ideas they prefer to express in another one. But there's also some stuff that seems to violate that common sense approach. There are some studies that seem to suggest that language can affect, maybe not totally determine, but definitely affect things like physical sense perception. So one neat little study involved color perception and language. It focused on native speakers of Russian and speakers of, I want to say English. If it wasn't English, then it was a language that shares the relevant traits with English. So I'll go for English because that's the one I'm talking in and it's going to be easier to explain in English. So in English, one particular set of visible wavelengths are recognized and designated as the color blue. People might draw the line in slightly different places between, on one end, blue and green and blue and purple on the other end. I get into arguments about this all the time. Is that, teal or aqua? Is it more indigo or violet? But on average, there is a defined range of hues that are accepted in English as the color blue. One concept, one range. In Russian, there are two categories distinguished within that range. So two totally different colors and conceptual categories. In English, we kind of can attempt to translate this as light blue and dark blue, but apparently that's not exactly or precisely the distinction that's being made. Regardless, in Russian, they're not saying light blue and dark blue. They're using two different, totally unrelated words. And again, there can be some overlap between whether you consider a given hue or shade belonging to one category or the other. But in English, it's all just going to be called blue. Okay, so you might think that that's just a little funky quirk of how different languages break down objective perception into subjective categories. Well, there might be something else going on here because they did a test, and by they, I mean some researchers who I'm sure are great fun at parties. They conducted a color matching test that was timed. So they would show a shade of blue on a screen, and then the test taker would have an option between two similar shades of blue, and the task was to choose the shade that was closest to the example. So it was a speed test. People were being timed. They tested Russian speakers and English speakers, and they found that the Russians were faster, particularly when the two options they were choosing between belonged to different color categories. So, for example, if one was considered an example of light blue and one was considered an example of dark blue, For Russian speakers, the performance would improve on those examples, even if the shades were very close together, than if they were choosing between two shades that were the same amount of different, I guess, but were both in the light blue category or both in the dark blue category. I'll link below to a description of the study that has some examples and some pictures so you can kind of get a better idea of how the test is set up. But the takeaway was that it did appear like the linguistic distinction provided an advantage in perceiving and categorizing different shades. This isn't the only example of the role of language in color perception. There's several that come up if you Google this. Wikipedia has just informed me that the Himba people have a ridiculous number of words and concepts that define different shades of green, and that seems to correlate with an improved perception of different greens and an ability to discriminate between them. It's also not just colors that are affected by this. So there exist in the world languages that use cardinal directions instead of directions that are oriented around the speaker's body. So, for example, instead of left and right, which are determined on the speaker's orientation, they just rely on north, south, east, and west. So to describe something's position, even at very small scale, you would get sentences like, oh, it's just to the north of your foot there. Or, yeah, it's on the shelf. I think I put it on the east side instead of on, I guess we would say on the right side or left, whichever one it was. Now, as you might predict, this only works if everyone has sort of a constant low-level awareness of where north and south and east and west are, that you would just kind of constantly be monitoring that. Whereas if you told me that I needed to turn more to the north or something, I would have to stop and figure it out based on landmarks and the position of the sun, and most likely, honestly, I would be converting things into the framework of left and right as I worked it out. Something like, okay, so west must be to my left, therefore I'm facing north, which puts south behind me, mapping the cardinal directions onto myself as the referent. Apparently, for most speakers of languages that rely on cardinal directions, they're kind of able to determine north and south as reflexively as I would determine left and right. Tolkien obviously wouldn't have had access to the more recent of these studies that rely more on things like brain imaging or the neat little experimental workarounds people have come up with over the years to eliminate confounding factors. But again, a lot of this stuff is observable or predictable based on the features of different languages, and linguistic determinism itself has been around since the 19th century. Sapir and Worf themselves, who became the public face of this idea, were engaging with it in the 20s and 30s, so this was an idea being discussed and debated and studied in the academic discipline of linguistics right around the same time that Tolkien was really starting to dig into his invented languages and invented histories and Middle-earth writings. So with that in mind, I thought I would poke around with some Elvish words that suggest a difference in either conceptualization or maybe even perception, whether that's a place where the Elvish languages make a distinction that's lacking in English, or whether it's a place where English is making a distinction that doesn't translate well to Elvish. I've talked before about amdir and estel, which are kind of big topics in their own right, and they represent the two different kinds of the word that apparently human languages represent as something like hope. Amdir literally means something like up-looking or looking up. I always think about it like, oh, things are looking up. The idea there is that events are suggesting an increased probability of a favorable outcome. And then there's estel, which is often translated to something like faith. And that's a kind of unprovable conviction that somehow things will work out in the end. Maybe they won't work out for you, but they will work out for the world in general. Or at least that there's a possibility that they can, despite whatever evidence you're getting to the contrary. The place where this distinction is really described is in the Athrabeth Finrod a Andrath, again, something I've talked about before and something that's kind of a giant topic to handle in itself. And in that conversation, the mortal woman Andreth says something like, oh, how can we have any hope when there's this and this and this against us and it's all insurmountable? And Finrod kind of goes, oh, you're talking about amdir, not estel. Yeah, no, there's no amdir in this situation, baby. I thought we'd already handled that. We are running this operation on pure estel at this point. Except for my insane oath-bedeviled half-cousins, they're strictly on amdir at this point, and frankly, it's not going too well for them. So that's a classic example of a place where the elves are talking about two things that they see as distinct. They're derived through totally different paths. And in the Athrobeth, the confusion caused by that actually kind of becomes a plot point and a moment of character development. And it really underlines how elves and men are operating from sometimes very different frameworks. Another good example, kind of going the opposite direction, is the word magic, which has been discussed at length elsewhere in some videos that I made, in some conversations that I've had with other people, in Discord conversations, by other commentators. Like, there's plenty of stuff out there on magic. And one of the most important observations is that Tolkien and his characters both point out on multiple occasions that elves don't really get the distinction that mortals are making when they talk about something being magical, or ask if something is magic. There is no Elvish word that really translates well for magic. If anything, they would maybe use something like craft or skill, but they would also apply that to methods and practices that we would consider non-magical as well. And this is definitely a place where I think perception is affecting language, and it might also kind of be going the other way as well. For mortals in general, if they can't perceive the causes or mechanisms for a certain thing happening, that seems to qualify it as, quote, magic. And elves can perceive a lot of those causes to a greater or lesser extent. So even if it's something that they can't personally understand or achieve, they can roughly see how it might be done. The whole magic technology continuum is really helpful at this point. If you think of the Palantiri, for example, as being like a smartphone, I don't know how a smartphone works, but I can see some of the principles that it's using. I can't build one, and I don't necessarily think of the process of building a smartphone as being magical. I would just say it's very advanced craft. And I definitely don't think I'm using magic when I use a smartphone, even though the effects are like, hey, this little piece of metal and glass is letting me communicate with people all over the world and see things that are happening far away. Can I explain exactly how it's doing it? No. Can I see the signal beaming down from space? No. But I still don't think of what I'm doing as magic. Maybe that's a mistake. Maybe I should consider it a little bit more magical, but honestly, I would say most people don't. Related to the magic question are the words for knowledge, of which there seem to be several. And again, we run into the problem here of Tolkien changing his mind on things, sometimes without realizing all the potential effects that making that change is going to have. But there are definitely several words for knowledge. We have knowledge as skill, the Kuru element in the name Kuru Finwë. There's Nole, which is knowledge as in wisdom or lore, which shows up in the name Nolo Finwë. So Finwë literally did name his sons both knowledgeable Finwë, but the kinds of knowledge being referenced were conceptually different, and for some reason he didn't predict that this was going to lead to, at the very least, an intense rivalry, but that's beside the point. There's also Ista or Istja, from which we get Istari, the name of the wizards, which just seems to translate pretty straightforwardly to knowing ones. And then there's the Sindarin element Ghoul that shows up in Morgul or Dol Guldur. And that's one of the closest words we get to magic per se, but the difference is Ghoul almost always has this negative connotation. It's translated as something more like dark arts or sorcery. Poking around on the internet, I found that Tolkien had come up with two potential derivations for this term. One related it to a root that originally meant dark-colored, like dark brown or black, and a word that eventually acquired sinister, evil connotations. But the other route that he entertained derives ghoul from gol, as in nole, as in wisdom, lore derived from long study, but also And inevitably we have to make this observation, as shows up in the term Noldor. And this version absolutely tickles me to no end. It's just this beautiful idea that if a wood elf, for instance, sees some uncanny expression of sinister power and complexity, to describe it, they in effect say, oh yeah, that's some Noldo level crap right there. Morgul Vale, you might as well be in Himring or something, man. Like, it's some dark stuff afoot. It just adds that little extra cherry of intercultural mistrust and scorn, made all the more delicious by the fact that, of course, this is the idiom the Noldor end up having to adopt if they really want to communicate with anyone. There's just a couple more here that I think are pretty fun. So one is the word for heart, which in English and a lot of human language, as far as I can tell, uses the same word to refer to the vital organ that is in your chest pumping your blood, and for the metaphorical seat of your emotions and intuition, sometimes even like your moral conscience. And even when we understand and can explain the different senses, we still use the same word. Everyone knows what I mean when I call someone heartless. I'm not literally suggesting that they lack a cardiac organ. I mean, they're lacking in human emotion or something. And the elves don't do this. The metaphorical use of the word heart that we see in phrases like my heart tells me or my heart leapt is a translation of the Elvish term ore, which has nothing to do with the word used for the organ. Now, Treebeard, who is admittedly not an elf, and uses Elvish in, I guess, kind of a German way, just swishing the words together to make new concepts, he uses the term Morimaite Sinkahonda as part of a description of orcs. These words aren't Entish, they're technically Quenya. Morimaite doesn't pose any real translation trouble, it just means black-handed. And Quenya, the word for hand, seems to carry both the physical and the metaphorical meanings that we would associate with it. Sinkahonda, on the other hand, is tricky because it seems to translate to flint-hearted, but the element that's referring to the heart there is the one that refers only to the physical organ. I couldn't quite track down the reference on this one, so take it with a grain of salt, but I do seem to remember Tolkien having to address this at some point. Sinkahonda appears in The Lord of the Rings, of course, so it's been published, it's out there. We know how much he hates to change around the published terms and names, if he doesn't have to, if he can at all avoid it. So after a little wiggling around, we come up with the explanation that the term does mean stone-hearted, but not in the way that we would figuratively understand that term in English. We might understand stone-hearted to mean callous, unfeeling, pitiless, but that's not the sense that Sinkahonda specifically has in Elvish, where it suggests apparently that the physical organ of the heart is so enduring and relentless that it seems to be mechanical or made of stone and flint rather than flesh and blood. So rather than ruthlessness, it suggests more relentlessness. It also fits really nicely with some of Tolkien's early descriptions of orcs as being crafted by Morgoth from earth and stone, an idea that does have a really nice mythic or metaphorical meaning, even if you are kind of walking back on whether it's literally true or not. Ore is itself one of many, many words that elves use to describe interior processes and experiences. So they draw fairly sharp distinctions between the mind, the so-called heart as the seat of emotions, and the will, and they also distinguish very sharply between different kinds of, I guess you'd call them mental activities. One of the little snippets or chapters in Nature of Middle-earth has Tolkien listing judging, guessing, imagining, and divining as some of the categories by which elves would understand the processes involved in forming an opinion on something. And the difference would lie not so much in the number of words, because, as we can see, clearly we have a lot of words in English to describe subtly different mental processes. It's more that these concepts would not be confused or overlap to the degree that they would in English. If I want to express a claim while also communicating that it's an opinion and not something I'm certain of, and if I say, well, I guess this versus I suppose this or I imagine that, it's boiling down to more or less the same thing. You're not interpreting it differently if I say, I guess it's this versus if I say, I suppose it's that. but the Elvish counterpart of those would apparently all be considered quite distinct and communicate something very specific about the source and degree of certainty of my actual knowledge. This is another case where it's not just, oh, elves are weird fantasy creatures with a weird language, because I know there's at least one human language that has a similar system of inflections that mark certainty and source. So, for example, the sentence, "a deer walked by," would be expressed differently if you had seen the deer walk by versus if you didn't see the deer personally, but you are seeing its tracks, versus if someone just told you that the deer had walked by. All of those would be marked somehow in the words that you would use. Dream seems to be another relevant example here. Like, there's a very specific concept that's best translated as dream that shows up in Gandalf's Quenya name Olorin, but there's also other words that could be translated as dream, but that the elves would understand to mean something different than the Olos Olor. And that one does seem to be related to the idea that Elvish sleep is a very different experience than human sleep. There's a lot of fun stuff. I could keep going. The Indil-Indur distinction is a really fun one that I think has a lot to do with potentially Tom Bombadil and also the Entwives. They all seem to be expressions of the same concept, weirdly enough. I also made a glancing reference to the root that apparently gave rise to the Quenya words for hand, craft, useful, good, beautiful, and excellent. It appears that all of these are linguistically related because elves are apparently such artists that they actually struggle to conceive of something having worth except as a function of the skill with which it was created, which is such an elvish problem to have. I absolutely love it, but I feel like we've maybe gone on long enough already, so for now I will wrap things up. Please, everyone, feel free to challenge or correct any gaps that you perceive in my understanding of Elvish, because this is definitely an area that I'm only just beginning to explore. I'm just dabbling in the shallows at this point, and I definitely look forward to hearing everyone's thoughts and examples that I've overlooked. So until next time, everyone, stay safe and be well, and thank you for listening.